Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on Planning for Sustainability, Supporting Community-Based Reentry Programs. My name is Ronin Davis, and I am a Grantee Technical Assistance Manager at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before we begin, I have a couple of technical notes. If you encounter connection or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. We'll also post that number to the chat box on your screen. Unfortunately, there are some connection issues we may not be able to resolve during the webinar. However, we are recording today's webinar and it will be posted on our website along with a copy of the slides used in today's presentation. Everyone who registered for the webinar will receive an email as soon as the webinar is available on our website. You may also check the website directly at csgjusticecenter.org. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for questions from the audience. To ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can ask questions at any point during the webinar, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible before we end today. Joining me for today's webinar, we have Erik Vecere, Vice President of Program Support at National Fatherhood Initiative, and Paul Solomon, the Executive Director of Sponsors, Inc. in Oregon. To get started, I want to give a quick here's the agenda for today's presentation. We'll begin with an overview of the National Reentry Resource Center, or NRRC. I will then discuss some key issues to consider when planning for sustainability based on the NRRC's work with Second Chance Act grantees. Then Erik Vecere from National Fatherhood Initiative will discuss some overarching strategies, followed by Paul Solomon, who will talk about Sponsors, Inc., a Second Chance Act grantee, and their approaches to sustaining reentry programming. We will conclude the webinar with time for questions. Contact information for each speaker will be posted at the end of the presentation. So as I said, we're going to do a quick overview of the Justice Center. The Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that serves policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels from all branches of government. Staff provides practical, nonpartisan advice and evidence-based, consensus-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. You can find our website at csgjusticecenter.org, and you can follow us on Twitter at CSGJC. In addition to serving policymakers, the Justice Center provides technical assistance to all Second Chance Act grantees through the National Reentry Resource Center, or NRRC, which is funded through the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance. We are constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. We encourage everyone who hasn't done so already to sign up for the newsletter by going to csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. The newsletter highlights Second Chance grantees, provides information on new publications and resources, as well as updates recipients on trainings, relevant news, and, most appropriate for this webinar, the latest reentry funding opportunities. Under the Justice Center's Correction and Reentry Division, I oversee the Community Initiatives portfolio, which provides technical assistance to all Second Chance Act grant programs awarded to nonprofit, community, and faith-based organizations. These grant recipients stand out because the majority of Second Chance Act grants are only awarded to units of local government, such as departments of corrections or sheriff's offices. While many of them may subcontract with nonprofit agencies, only certain Second Chance Act grants are available directly to nonprofit agencies, including tribal and faith-based organizations. While these grants almost always require a mentoring component, they have different focuses, including providing mentoring and transitional services to adults in reentry, mentoring and providing reentry services to incarcerated fathers and mothers under the age of 25, and supporting children and families of incarcerated parents. Of the over 500 organizations, agencies, or departments that have directly received Second Chance Act funds since 2009, over 180 nonprofit organizations have been the primary award recipient. While this webinar is geared toward nonprofits and will cover a number of cross-cutting issues and strategies, some organizations like tribal nonprofits and faith-based agencies face unique challenges that we may not be able to address today. There will be a survey sent out after the webinar, and I encourage you to fill that out and specify any topics you would like to see addressed in future learning opportunities. The Justice Center and the NRRC have been working to provide more support and resources geared toward community-based organizations. On our website, you can download the guide pictured on this slide that was developed to offer practical recommendations for how state government officials and community-based service providers can better use the limited resources they have to help people released from prisons and jails successfully and safely rejoin neighborhoods and their families. In September 2013, my colleagues produced a webinar on sustainability specifically for recipients of mentoring reentry programs. This webinar will expand on some of the concepts that they addressed. I encourage you to review our website for these and other resources. This particular webinar came about because sustainability is one issue that comes up in the technical assistance we provide for every grantee. When it comes to providing social services for a population in need, it is never easy to have to turn people away because the funding has ended. A common issue that we encounter in our support of grantees are programs not planning for sustainability soon enough. When is soon enough? When you start planning your program is when you should start thinking about sustainability. For example, if you plan to use a curriculum that requires a costly training, look into whether the provider offers train-the-trainer sessions. Think about what other programs your agency provides that could benefit from the same curriculum and how the cost could be split among them or have existing staff train new staff. Consider what you are planning to incorporate into the program that could continue in the absence of a time-limited funding source. First and foremost, it is important to establish who is responsible for figuring out how the program or parts of it will continue. While all staff will most likely play some role in sustainability, establishing a point person to oversee the planning will help keep the process cohesive and moving. If the program has multiple partner agencies involved, you may want to consider convening a sustainability working group that could take point. In smaller programs, it may be the program director or the agency's development staff member who takes on this responsibility. Whoever it is, they should be identified early on, and program staff should be aware of their role. As your point person or working group begins to strategize, they will need to think about who should know about the program. While it is important to spread the word about your program externally, before that can happen, you must ensure that your own agency is aware of your program. I've held many jobs where I've gotten stuck in my own silo, and I knew there was a program that had something to do with health insurance, but I could not tell you anything more than that. Staff that don't work in your program don't need to know every detail, but if need be, could they make cross-referrals from their program? If you are running a fatherhood program, for instance, and your agency also has an after-school program, do the after-school program staff have enough information to identify potential participants? Do they know what to say if a grandmother of one of their students asks about services for her son who's about to get out of prison and hasn't seen his child in some time? Of course, the external awareness of the program is also very important. How does the public learn about your program? How do you keep your stakeholders updated? Drumming up public support can lead to future funding opportunities as well as more participants that may one day showcase the success of the program. Consider how your program will utilize media, find a public figure to champion the program, and build community relationships that could lead to donations or in-kind services. This also pertains to program partners and ensuring that there is a system to keep them updated on the program's progress. Now, while you may have your elevator pitch down for communicating externally, remember that potential donors may have different interests. In addition to establishing who should know about your program, your leadership should identify what should be known about your program and be flexible enough to adjust the message for the audience. If you're running a fatherhood reentry program, which is my go-to because I've worked with quite a few of them, you may have a potential funder who has never worked in reentry before, but is committed to supporting programs that strengthen families. When talking to them, you'll want to focus on the aspects of your program that improve outcomes for youth and build healthier relationships between family members. If you're presenting that same program to your community supervision or probation parole partner, you may want to focus on how your program helps fathers find work and how they have to show up multiple times a week to your office at a certain time, potentially giving probation officers another way to ensure compliance with their requirements. Keep in mind that public agencies like probation and parole could receive grants for which only government agencies may apply, in which case you could set yourself up to be an ideal subcontractor on that grant. And that segues perfectly into funding diversity. Federal grants are notoriously restrictive. The big issue the programs we work with often talk about is not being able to encourage participation with meals or gift cards. Consider what other funding sources could support these incentives. Private donations, in-kind contributions. One of the programs I work with does a toy drive each year and then has the fathers in their program pick a gift from the donations to give to their child at the holidays. Mr. Solomon at Sponsors will address this in more detail with examples of how to leverage different funding streams as well as connections in the community later in the presentation. The last consideration when planning for sustainability is data. Data is so important and useful for many reasons. Data is how you can show your program success. It's what will back up the message you want your program to send. The other useful aspect of data is it can show you where improvements are needed. If your program starts with 50 participants and only 10 successfully complete, are you able to identify when most people drop off? Being able to identify challenges and respond to them is another way to appeal to funders and partner agencies. At this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Erik Vecere of the National Fatherhood Initiative to dive into some strategies for sustainability. As a reminder, throughout the webinar, we encourage you to submit questions in the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand corner of the WebEx screen. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronin, and it's great to be with you all today, and hopefully everybody's week is going very well. I am going to be taking a much broader stroke approach to my portion of the presentation before turning it over to Paul, who will be able to speak more from a direct service perspective on some things that they've done. And so with that in mind, my agenda for my portion of the presentation today is going to focus on a few things from a broader perspective, including some concept around asset mapping for fund development, and then what I like to call the 7 no's and 7 no-no's of fundraising, as well as some avenues to raise money. So asset mapping for fund development, this was something I came across when I was doing some research for our community mobilization approach here at National Fatherhood Initiative. And I came across this concept of asset-based community development, which their acronym is ABCD. And when I came across it, I just thought that this could have a great application for revealing certain areas and blind spots in our communities that we don't even know are assets. And this ABCD was developed out of Northwestern University. And I really found it appealing because of its premise that communities can drive the development process themselves by identifying and mobilizing existing but often unrecognized assets, and then respond to and create local economic opportunity. So by taking that idea and applying it to your fund development strategy, the question becomes, how do you uncover those unrecognized assets in your organization and even your community that can diversify your fund development? The way to do that is to develop a series of questions that you can ask community leaders and then mapping their assets in a document that you can manage. And some use, something as primitive as an Excel document. I've seen some that use more online platform or using the cloud or other kinds of data management systems. But, if there's one idea that I want to emphasize today, it's that sustainability is more than just dollars. It can be someone's time, it can be someone's expertise, or the ability to connect you to other funding opportunities that they may be able to unlock. So here's a sample of a survey that we developed at NFI as part of our community mobilization approach. And you can see we first start with asking community leaders questions related to our overarching issue. So for us, that's fatherhood. You may need to modify it to have a mentoring and reentry aspect or a combination of those things. But this is important as it frames it within an issue that they should see the value in, but that you may have to raise some awareness before they're even on board to that point. You can also see that we ask them to answer these questions from the perspective of their specific sector. Sectors can include, the healthcare sector, business, social service, nonprofit sector, the government sector, philanthropic sector, and so forth. But once we do that, we then move into questions that get at specific assets or resources that they can provide or maybe that they know of. And you can feel free to reference these questions that we've developed as part of our community mobilization approach, modify them to your need or use some of them verbatim if you want. I want to draw your attention to question 14, where you'll see it's geared towards anything in the community that they know of that could be expanded to include the component that you're providing, such as fatherhood, mentoring, or reentry. And then we finally move into a call to action for them to consider. So this is how you can uncover those sustainability assets that are currently unknown to you. Now, this is an example of how the ABCD approach divides their communities up. The broader categories are local institutions, citizen associations, and gifts of individuals. And then you can see how this alone may open up areas of your community that you haven't considered before just by identifying the groups and subgroups in your community. Because I know when we looked at this for the first time, there were certain elements and areas of our community that we hadn't really thought of before. And by breaking it up in this way, you can really challenge yourself to get into some of the areas and work with some of the community leaders and organizations that I like to say are not the known suspects. They're more like the unknown suspects when it comes to working with fathers and families and reentry and mentoring kinds of programs. But they can provide a lot of additional kinds of resources that, again, may have previously been undiscovered in your work. So now moving a little bit more into the 7 no's and 7 no-nos of fundraising, I'm going to just take a few minutes and share some of those with you. But we're also going to talk about the avenues to raise money, and there's 5 areas there that I have selected to talk about some advantages and disadvantages and maybe some questions that you may want to ask yourselves as you continue to look at these different opportunities or avenues to raise money. So the 7 no's of fundraising. Before you can be effective in fundraising, you must have a clear mission and vision. After all, how can we expect a funder to designate his or her resources to something if its mission and vision isn't clear? It's important to not only know who your allies are, but also who your enemies are. And I know that's kind of a strong term to use there, but I've seen in some of the work that we've done and even in some of our own communities that, there may be some other groups in the community that are planting bad seeds in hope of tarnishing your reputation, or you may also be dealing with individuals who just don't share your ideology. And it's important to identify that so that maybe you can create some bridges to smooth things over or to find creative and innovative ways, to work together with some of those groups. But you have to first know where they're coming from, and not all of them may be very happy about maybe your approach or the way that you may be doing things, or the fact that you may be pulling funds, maybe from their perspective that you have not been aware of. When you converse with potential funders, they will want to know clearly what their money is and isn't going to be used for. So make sure that you're very clear on that. There are many other good and worthy causes out there, so why should yours be funded over theirs? Be prepared to share how fatherhood, mentoring, and reentry are the deeper-rooted issues to some of the other issues that they fund. And then finally, make sure you know what the donor expects up front so that you can determine if your infrastructure is set up for that or not. Sometimes we bite off a little bit more than we chew, or maybe there were some questions that we can ask prior to being funded to make sure that there aren't some things that we don't have in place that we need to address. So the 7 no-nos of fundraising. The first one, no making money, if I'm pronouncing this correct, the reason ditch, which is the most important reason for your existence. And there have been, some organizations that have put so much time and energy into raising funds that they overlook opportunities to positively impact families they're trying to serve. And so, there's this balancing act that we all have to, be sensitive to and kind of walk that tight wire sometimes that, it can become detrimental if it's pulling us away from our mission vision and maybe from some opportunities where we can be putting our energy in outcomes and losing focus on that. It's also critical that you communicate a sense of gratefulness to all of your funders, no matter what level they gave. It's entirely possible that some of your smaller donors may turn into big-time donors if you nurture the relationship effectively and if you make them feel appreciated. Their situations can change quickly and may now be in a position to give more. So when possible, be very specific in what you're asking for. Funders need specifics to take to their boards or for their own reference. And I know we even at NFI sometimes we've had to force ourselves to distill some, kind of bigger vision or grand goal that we have down into something that is that's manageable for them to get their minds around. And also we've had to be careful about holding ourselves to high standards. So there's really no room for sloppiness. And by that I mean in all aspects of fundraising, from the writing in and the formatting of the proposal to the meetings and the follow-up letters. Really pay attention to details. It's no different than any relationship that we want to have and want to keep it healthy, is that, it's the details, it's the small things that matter and that build up and make a big difference. You also want to be careful not to fall into the trap of mission creep. And this is when you go after funding that does not relate directly to your mission. And, it may seem enticing and it may even feel like, this is pretty close to our mission. Maybe if we just adjust this, or, if we did this over here, but that can become a slippery slope. And then before you know it, you're just chasing funds at the expense of what your core mission was, and then you start to lose focus. Lastly, avoid taking a tone of despair where your services will disappear forever if you don't receive X number of dollars by a certain time. This simply communicates instability, and few people would want to donate to that kind of a situation. And this may seem really obvious, but you do have to ask. If you never ask for money, you'll never raise any money, and no one is going to make a contribution unless you ask them to. So when moving into how to raise money, I just wanted to, quickly go through these 5 major avenues to raise money, and I'll break each down in the following slides. But I'd like to challenge you to, think about how you might map out which of these avenues or a combination of these avenues are best for your situation, and kind of looking even, as Ronin said, beyond the grant that you may have received already, if it's a public grant in particular, to be thinking beyond that and looking at some of these different categories. Now, public support funds usually come from federal or state grants, such as the Department of Health and Human Services or Department of Justice. Here are some advantages of those. It's certainly a category of support that you can continue to get ongoing support. It's easier to renew your programs from year to year. A lot of times, projects at the federal and even state level are multi-year projects that are contingent on how well you do from year to year. But if you're doing well, then you can usually count on multiple years of support. And then, of course, they also offer larger amounts of support And they're not a, quote, fickle funder. And I'll talk more about that, when we get into the private foundation, where sometimes, private foundations can get a little bit fickle, whereas in public support, there tends to be a little bit more, constant, consistency from year to year. So there were many years when NFI received a lot of public grants. And these are some disadvantages that affected our organizational culture, and so wanted to just share these with you. There were certainly aggressive timelines and a lot of paperwork. We had to set up additional infrastructure like additional accounting staff and legal consultants. There were some private foundations and private donors that decided not to fund us because they either believed we didn't need the extra funds or because they didn't agree with the government's stance on certain issues. There were also times when cash flow issues came up depending on when the public funds were released to us. And we found that the large amounts of public funds sometimes masked some deeper financial issues within our organization that we would have addressed sooner had we not had the public funding. We've also had to have additional protocol in place for staff accountability. So for those of you, I know many of you are already receiving public support as part of these grants, but there may be some of you who aren't and may be considering it, and those would be some things to consider with that. But since many of you are currently receiving some form of public funds, you've probably gone through some iteration of this checklist. However, you should take a fresh look at it and look at how you see public funds fitting into your overall funding strategy going forward. So if we move into foundation support, these are just some advantages of private foundation, where you certainly have foundations in a position that they want to give away money. Some foundations do make large gifts. Foundation information is easily accessible and it's easy to find. Oftentimes you can just go, online and you can look at all of the different kinds of issues that they funded, the organizations they funded, and even the dollar amounts that they funded. And also foundations can give credibility to your funding base. So if you are trying to approach other foundations or even public support or other corporate support, you can leverage these foundations that are supporting you and, as a way to, to build a certain level of trust with other potential funders. You'll also need to look at the foundation landscape in your region and assess what your relationship is with these foundations. Some of the disadvantages of foundation support include more competition and lengthy approval times. Foundations tend to focus more on project-specific initiatives rather than general operations, so that's another concern sometimes, that they may really want you to do something that is just related to one particular kind of project rather than something more broadly supporting your organization. They may also try to change elements of the project that you feel strongly about. One of the most challenging things we've had to deal with some foundations is their tendency to be fickle, as I mentioned earlier. There have been some foundations that have changed their focus from fatherhood to some other issue practically overnight. And so, it's very difficult then to be in a position to get additional funds if they've really changed their focus on what it is that they, what they're prioritizing. And then this is a checklist for readiness for foundation support. You want to ask yourself, is your organization keeping good records of foundations that support your organization? Have you checked with board and staff to see if they have any foundation connections? Have you looked at foundation deadlines and how they match your needs schedule? Hopefully you have a good budget in place, and do you know how to approach foundations? And there are some great tools, resources out there as well, that can provide webinars and so forth on, specifically on foundations and how to approach them. But most of that really can come from looking at those foundation websites, as you know, every foundation kind of has their own way of doing things and even way of submitting applications and so forth. So I really recommend that you investigate at least at that level, and then maybe even try to talk to you know, a program officer or somebody at the foundation that can give you even more details. Corporate support is another great way to think about diversifying your funding, and I just put some advantages and disadvantages on this slide. Of course, advantages to corporate support are likely to sustain funding year after year. They do lend credibility to your work. They can help you get gifts from other corporations because they have their own network as well that you might be able to access. They may have in-kind gifts. They might want to be a part of your board. They may have somebody that, or as they learn more, become aware of what you're doing, may be motivated to be more of an active part. And you might get some general ops gifts as well. Now, disadvantages is, of course, that most gifts are small. Many are, you know, 5,000 or less, especially when you're first getting connected with them. There can be an obligation to publicize the gift. You might want involvement, or they might want involvement in your promotional activities. Now, just as them being on your board might be an advantage, that could also be a disadvantage depending on the situation and what their motives are for them being on the board. So you do have to vet that carefully. And they might only support specific projects that they can associate with. So it may be hit or miss on that front. But when you're looking at approaching corporations or you know, businesses, do you know what kind of corporate contacts your board and staff have? Have you investigated that? Do you keep good data on corporate contributors and individual contributors who might be associated with different corporations? Are you ready to offer something in return for a corporate contribution? And do you know how to approach corporations? And then finally, individual donors is another thing that you can look at, and some advantages to, you know, soliciting individual donations is that there's more ways to reach them. There can be a variety of individual interests that support a variety of your programs and projects. Individuals are likely to be faithful. They tend to really, you know, kind of rally behind those things that they're involved with. Sustained funding, and depending on the depth of the pockets, they might give larger gifts. And we do, from time to time, have some high net worth donors that really do get involved. And again, coming back to those questions that I put in terms of doing an assessment at the very beginning is a great way to uncover some of these kinds of opportunities. Some disadvantages is it can take time to cultivate. That takes research effort and good record keeping because there are just so many of them, you know, as you begin to build an individual donor base. Typically, it does take a lot of individuals to equal one foundation or corporate gift. And they can nickel and dime you to death. So sometimes just because, you know, they're typically, you know, smaller kind of donations, it's just a lot more to manage. Not that it isn't worth it, but you just need to make sure, as some of these questions in your checklist for readiness slide here ask, you know, do you have a system in place to track donor contributions? Do you have an acknowledgement system in place, which is very, very important for developing relationships with these individual donors? Do you have somebody specifically assigned to donor relations? Has anyone in your organization had experience soliciting major gifts? What is the largest single gift your organization has ever been given? And do you know how to approach individual donors? Those would be some questions to look at for approaching individual donors as a possible addition to your funding portfolio. Some advantages here to this next category, which is fees. And if you think about this is something that I know a lot of nonprofits in particular shy away from, but those nonprofits that I talk to that do have some fee for service tend to do very well, and it really does help diversify them. And sometimes they do it with relationships with local judges and court systems where some of the courts will offset that, or they'll either mandate or strongly recommend that a father go to a particular fatherhood program, and then that the father will then pay the fee to the nonprofit. So, so charging fee for services, opens up other sectors of your community, such as the business, healthcare, and academic sectors. And again, it will help diversify your funding portfolio. So when a client pays directly for the service, one of the dynamics that I found is that he is more vested and therefore more committed to participating to get the value out of his investment. There's a perceived value there. And also, if a third-party organization is willing to pay for your service, then it must be helping them meet its objectives. And if that's the case, then the organization will make a greater effort referring clients and even help with your outcomes. One disadvantage of charging fees is the revenue generated from this can be hit or miss, meaning you can never be certain how the demand is going to fluctuate. If you charge fathers, it can also make recruitment more challenging depending on the father's resources. And finally, with the swing in demand for the services, it can be difficult to cover the salary for someone to be on staff to meet those needs. So when you're looking at, your level or degree of readiness for this particular kind of funding strategy, do you offer a service that could be valuable to other sectors? Do you have the capacity to handle the demand if necessary? I mean, sometimes that's, we always have to be careful what we ask for, because sometimes we get it and then we're running around trying to figure out how to address it. But again, this is something that you can begin to prepare for ahead of time. Are there individuals in your organization who are creative enough to successfully market your service effectively? And can your organization process the additional accounts payable and receivable that will result? Because there is, again, a different kind of tracking with this kind of a funding source. So, so I hope that as you go through and even after the webinar is over, that you will refer to these checklists for readiness and some of the advantages and disadvantages as a way to look at your funding portfolio and to begin, challenging yourself a little bit beyond, particularly if you're receiving a lot of funds from public sources, that now would be a good time to begin considering some of these other possibilities. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Paul to talk more specifically about some of the work that he's been doing with his organization.
Great. Thank you, Eric. That was a wonderful presentation. So to start, I would like to give a special thanks to the co-presenters, Erik, Ronin, and the staff at the National Reentry Resource Center, who've been just a pleasure to work with on this. And I also really want to thank the National Reentry Resource Center and the Department of Justice for supporting these wonderful webinars. I've presented on a few of them and have attended many of them and find them to be very useful. So to get started, I am going to talk to you a little bit about our experiences growing and sustaining a prisoner reentry program. I'm going to spend some time talking about the services we provide to offer a little context when we get into the funding diversification and ways of sustaining federally funded reentry initiatives. So to begin, let me share a little bit about sponsors. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was founded in 1973 by a group of Catholic nuns and community activists to address the issues of young men returning to our community from prison who are homeless and indigent. In 1988, we started our first housing program in the house pictured in this slide with 5 transitional beds. We've grown incrementally over the years to address the burgeoning prison population in our state. We now operate 15 buildings on 6 sites with 150 beds of transitional and permanent housing. And the agency's philosophy is based on the belief that people can and do change, and a strategic intervention at the appropriate moment can serve as a catalyst in that change process. What that means to us is our experience has taught us that the day people get out of prison, are most opportune moments to provide these type of interventions. We also have embraced the risk needs responsivity model, triaging our limited resources to those individuals who are at highest risk to reoffend. We use a range of validated risk assessment tools to drive our service delivery model. We use the LSCMI, that's our primary risk assessment. We use the Eureka, which gauges a person's stage of change, and various specialized assessments. What this does is it allows us to identify, to begin with, the top 2 criminogenic risk factors that we address with in-house programs in the proper dosage, while doing our best to address responsivity issues, things like mental illness, trauma, cultural learning styles, which are all very important to a person's ability to succeed in any of the programs that we provide. While a lot of this may be old news to many of you, it's an important factor in developing and sustaining community-based reentry programs. More and more of the funding is driven by adherence to the risk needs responsivity model. Our target population is men and women releasing from state and county correctional institutions who've been convicted as adults and assessed as moderate to very high risk to reoffend. Additionally, we target those individuals who are homeless and indigent upon release, and also prioritize veterans, seniors, people with disabilities, sex offenders, and women with children. Come on, next slide, there we go. Talk a little bit about our facilities. In early spring, we are going to complete construction of our newest project, which will add 54 units of permanent housing to give us a total of over 200 beds across 6 sites, all designed to serve people with criminal histories. Currently, our 2 largest facilities are transitional housing programs that include a 74-bed men's facility and a 27-bed women's facility. Residents of both programs stay an average of 60 to 90 days, and also include an honors program where participants can stay for up to a year. As you can see from the pictures, we take great pride in the aesthetics of our properties and go to great extents to keep them in good condition. We believe that it's important to our clients that our buildings represent a contradiction to their institutional experiences. Furthermore, we believe that we work really hard to be good neighbors and recognize the importance of doing our part to enhance the livability of the communities where our facilities are located. Program delivery. Upon completion of the previously mentioned risk assessment, a case plan is developed where sponsors participants are referred to a range of in-house services, including a comprehensive one-stop reentry resource center that provides employment and education services, a mentoring program that I'll talk more about later that was started with the BJA grant, where we have matched up over 600 trained volunteer mentors with individuals releasing from prison, cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational enhancement therapy, substance abuse treatment, which we contract out through a local provider but it's provided on site, veteran services that are funded through a VA grant and per diem program, evidence-based parenting curriculum designed for people with criminal histories, a legal clinic through a partnership with the University of Oregon School of Law, intensive case management, and other community supports. Program development. This is really a critical piece of being able to start and sustain a program. Part of our success stems from our ability to identify and cultivate program champions. We had a board chair for many years who was a respected business owner, and he would regularly go and speak to Rotary groups and community events, and he would talk to his peers in the business community wearing a pair of state-issued sweatpants and a plastic bag with makeshift belongings that someone from prison might be carrying around. And he would ask his friends in the business community, would you be willing to hire me looking like this? Then he would launch into a passionate presentation about the necessity of providing basic services to people who have made mistakes and deserve a second chance. Finding people who can champion your programs is essential. Furthermore, advocacy is also a critical element to the success of most reentry programs. Ultimately, Sponsors was able to acquire its first community corrections contract over 25 years ago, in part due to the dogged determination of an executive director who attended every single public meeting he could to advocate and illustrate the need for reentry services in our community. Our local government did not come to this conclusion easily or on their own. Education and advocacy played a huge role. I would also stipulate that most programs like ours are going to require a degree of public funding to survive. So it is all the more important to cultivate relationships with public safety and elected officials. I also want to take a moment to talk about the importance of private donations, and Erik did a great job of kind of breaking down the various types of funding. So let me speak for a moment about this. While donations oftentimes may make up a small percentage of your overall budget, they really are critically important. So for us, we've got about a $3 million budget, and we bring in about $150,000 a year in private donations. So as a percentage of our budget, it's really only about 5%. But there are many ways that that money can be used, and the people who support us are critical to our mission. So let me give you some examples. For one, this type of funding is most flexible unless you're soliciting gifts for a specific program or campaign. This can augment restrictive grants or contracts that may not allow you to pay for things like food, recreational activities, or incentives. In addition, donors are program supporters, and as such are able to advocate on your behalf when necessary. During the most recent recession, Sponsors was facing some pretty significant budget cuts to our county contracts, and we were able to get our supporters to testify publicly at meetings, write letters and emails, and schedule personal visits with their elected officials. As a result, the cuts that were being made were almost wholly restored as a result of these efforts and our ability to convince our elected officials to go out and find new funding sources to offset the cuts that we had experienced. I also want to share a couple of anecdotes about donations and what they can turn into. A couple of years ago, I had an individual, an older woman, come by and ask for a tour. And I gave her a tour, and the next day she followed back up and said that she had a bag of returnable deposit cans and some half-used Sudoku books. Would we be interested in taking them? And I thought, sure, you know, there's someone in the program that would be more than happy to turn those cans in for a few extra bucks, and we would do something with the Sudoku books. So she came by, dropped them off. 2 days later, I got a call from her stockbroker who gave us it was about a $5,000 gift. And I really believe that the first part was a test to see whether or not we would be willing to take cans. Similarly, I'll tell you another story about a donor that had been giving to us in the amount of about $100 a year for the last 20 years. And we had done kind of the normal donor cultivation, worked with this individual, thanked him profusely for his gifts. When he died, he left us a six-figure gift. And every year we get gifts, legacy gifts, gifts from people who have passed away, oftentimes that are unexpected, but really illustrate the importance of cultivating those donor relationships, because you never know when that next $50 a month donor turns into a person who gives you a house or a large gift in their will. Okay, next slide. Come on. Funding diversification. The more diversity you have in funding, the more insulated you are from significant cuts. When I started working at Sponsors 15 years ago, we had 2 county contracts that represented approximately 80% of our funding. At that time, I recognized that had we lost one of those contracts, we would have been laying off a significant portion of our staff. From that point on, I've worked hard to diversify our funding. Over the past 15 years, we've been able to create over 20 new contracts with 10 different federal, state, and county agencies, in addition to foundation grants, fees for services, and individual donations. If we were to lose a single contract today, we would most likely be able to absorb it. I've also listed a current estimate of the percentages of our income stream, so you can see kind of the breakout of our current funding, our revenue allocation today. About 45% of it's government contracts, 20% of it's grants, state or federal grants, 15% is fees for services, about 5% is individual donations, and 15% is foundation grants and a mishmash of other miscellaneous income streams. Another way to diversify an agency's portfolio is to purchase or build facilities that become agency assets. In our case, we have strategically sought to purchase or build the majority of our facilities using public money. As such, we've been able to significantly reduce our overhead. A few years ago, we moved over 40 men out of 2 scattered site facilities that were staffed 24 hours a day into a new 74-bed facility that was built using low-income housing tax credits. As a result, we were able to increase our capacity and save over $100,000 a year in rent payments, not to mention the staffing economy of scales that we achieve. There are a variety of sources out there designed to provide funding for low-income housing, including tax credits, home funds, community development block grants, foundation grants, and other sources. It's not uncommon for state or federal grants to be restrictive and limit the way money can be spent. Furthermore, you may find that the grants provide the bare minimum in your ability to fund a project. As a result, it's important that you not put all of your eggs in one basket. Foundation grants, individual donations, corporate sponsorships, and targeted fundraising events are all ways to augment funding that can be used more flexibly. Some years ago, we received a mentoring grant that restricted our ability to use funds for extracurricular activities, food, and cash-like incentives such as gift cards. Fortunately, we were able to tap into some foundation grant money and individual donation money that was much more flexible to fully fund the program. We'll talk a little bit about an innovative funding initiative. Recently, we've witnessed the advent of a range of novel funding initiatives, including social impact bonds, which are also known as Pay for Success. HUD and the Department of Justice recently released a Pay for Success NOFA that looks at the nexus between homeless people with criminal histories and the effectiveness of permanent supported housing. Investor funds will pay for the intervention. Grantees will develop outcome metrics that will be tracked in addition to a randomized control trial to evaluate the effectiveness of the intervention. A back-end payer is lined up to reimburse the cost of services provided they are effective. Usually this is state or local government. Hopefully projects like these will foster additional investment in proven strategies. I'm going to provide a couple of different examples of sustaining grant-funded reentry grant-funded programs. The first is a 2013 BJA Second Chance Act demonstration grant that we received. This was a one-year $750,000 grant that paid for transitional housing, wraparound services to moderate to high-risk men and women releasing from state prison. It paid for the salary of a parole officer. Services included sex offender treatment, alcohol and drug treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, and supports including funding to pay for bus passes, identification, risk assessments, and a range of other things. One of the things we did early on was made a decision that we would try and extend the funding for as long as possible. We asked for and received a 12-month no-cost extension. And I should say BJA is really good about allowing no-cost extensions. As a result of stretching this grant out for 2 years, we were then trying to sustain what became a $375,000 annual grant versus a $750,000 annual grant. The passage of the Affordable Care Act allowed us to pay for the treatment costs that were in the grant when the grant ended. And as a result, our cost to fully sustain this project dropped from about $750,000 a year to $200,000 a year. The majority of the project was paid for with justice reinvestment funding, which I'll talk a little bit about in greater detail in a minute. But what I will say is our local criminal justice planning body, the Public Safety Coordinating Council, was the body that monitored the grant and was instrumental in sustaining funding using these justice reinvestment funds. We were able to use local crisis funds to pay for bus passes and ID, and also small foundation grants were able to cover the cost of our office supplies and ancillary costs. But really, the key costs for staffing and direct program services were paid for with the justice reinvestment funds. Here's another example of a grant-funded program that we were able to sustain. This was originally a 2-year burn JAG grant that paid for 3 pilot projects in Oregon, including sponsors Reentry Resource Center, or what we refer to as our one-stop, that was designed to provide employment and education-related services and be a one-stop for any person in Lane County, regardless of whether they were on local, state, or federal supervision to access services. The grant was issued by Oregon's Criminal Justice Commission and importantly included an evaluation at the end of the grant that really proved useful in our ability to sustain the program. The evaluation found that participants were 31% less likely to be charged with a new offense compared to a control group. Furthermore, they did a cost-benefit analysis that showed that for every dollar invested, the state saved over $14 in avoided corrections and victimization costs. This data was really useful in acquiring a 3-year SAMHSA offender reentry grant that allowed us to sustain and enhance the program. That grant is getting ready to end, and we're replacing it with a Department of Labor grant that will start at the end of this year. So in this case, we've used a variety of different grants to sustain the original program. Finally, I want to share with you our 2010 BJA Second Chance Act mentoring grant to nonprofits that originally provided $300,000 for 2 years of funding. The original grant matched 200 medium to high-risk men and women releasing from prison with trained volunteer mentors in the community. Prior to the grant ending, we began writing mentorship positions into other grants and contracts. By 2014, we had funded multiple positions in the program through a variety of federal grants and local community corrections contracts. Fortunately, as we had been able to build and sustain this program, we applied for the 2015 3-year BJA Second Chance Act Comprehensive Community-Based Adult Reentry Program Utilizing Mentors Grant that provided $1 million in funding over 3 years. One of the nice things about this grant is it includes a randomized control trial, which again, I can't underscore the importance of evaluating the programs that you have. My hope is that when we finish with this randomized control trial, that we'll be able to go to our legislature or our state or our county public safety planning body and use this data to ask for long-term funding for the program. Now I'm going to talk about justice reinvestment initiatives. For those of you who are not familiar with justice reinvestment, it's a data-driven approach to correction policy that seeks to cut prison spending and reinvest savings in practices that have been empirically shown to improve public safety and hold individuals accountable. The map below lists those federally funded JRI states. However, there are other states in addition to the ones that are in blue on this map that have passed their own legislation within their states without federal support. So as you can see, well over half the states in the country are now engaging in some type of justice reinvestment initiative. In 2013, Oregon passed its version of justice reinvestment, House Bill 3194. At the time, the state was projecting a need to add over 2,000 prison beds at a cost of over $600 million in the coming decade. Legislation that included sentencing reform was passed that was designed to flatline prison growth over the preceding 10 years. And what they did is, a part of that legislation, the state created a Justice Reinvestment Grant Program that provided incentive funding to Oregon's 36 counties. The state required counties to invest the funding in evidence-based programs that did one of two things: either divert people from prison to reduce the county's dependence on prison beds, or work on the back end and reduce recidivism for people releasing from prison. Funding is allocated based on projected savings from avoided prison expansion costs and has grown incrementally each biennium, as you can see on the slide. Also want to talk a little bit about the challenges of establishing reentry type programs and what is commonly known as NIMBY, or not in my backyard. Citing reentry programs can be a real challenge, so here are a few tips to consider. Anticipate and plan for resistance. Include it in your timeline. Project zoning appeals and worst case scenarios should be built in. Hold community meetings in a form that invites comments and questions. Be transparent and responsive, and this is really important because if you are not transparent and upfront with people, invariably it will come back to bite you. In the past, we've gone door to door when necessary, and I usually partner up with one of our managers at parole and probation or the sheriff's office, so that we're really bringing kind of a unified voice around the public safety value that these programs provide in our communities. Invite key allies. And this is another piece that I think is really important, to publicly support your effort. Include public safety and elected officials as well as neighborhood association representatives. And champion your track record of success. We have invited neighbors to our other buildings so that they can see what they look like, that we're not driving down the values of properties in our neighborhood, that we really are good neighbors. So I think, championing your track record is important. Consider developing a citizens advisory committee or some other formal process that publicizes open meetings and document proceedings and gives neighbors an opportunity to weigh in. Be the neighbor you want to have. Listen to people's concerns, and be willing to compromise. It goes a long way. Finally, don't expect 100% buy-in. Some people will never get there. Nothing you do or say is going to please them. But you don't need 100% support to proceed. However, you do not want to start a project without doing your basic due diligence. Again, it will bite you. So this is the product of our most recent efforts with the neighbors, a 54-unit permanent housing complex with a community service building that will provide a range of supports for people that are living independently. We are targeting veterans, seniors, people with disabilities, people with sex offense convictions will be allowed to live here, but this is a permanent housing project. Advocacy. So funding decisions are often made at public meetings. Make your voice heard. Participate in local and state public safety boards, budget committees, and task forces. Many communities lack content expertise in this area of reentry. Advocate for reentry positions on public safety committees. Cultivate relationships with public safety and elected officials who sit on these bodies. Create a quid pro quo relationship. They need you as much as you need them. Furthermore, as I indicated previously, these bodies can also play a critical role in your efforts to develop plans to sustain the grants over time. We have worked very closely with our local Public Safety Coordinating Council to find ways to continue funding our most significant grant-funded initiatives. Finally, I want to kind of wrap up with how you present your program. Storytelling and compelling anecdotes can be an important way to connect with people. You need to find ways to talk about and humanize the people we serve. I often ask audiences to imagine the worst thing they've ever done and consider that as a result they wound up in prison for that thing. Then I ask them to consider what they would do if they did not have any support or families waiting for them when they got out of prison, that they were released homeless and indigent. What would they do? Where would they go? How would they survive? This is a good place to insert a story about a person who has successfully benefited from your services. It's also important to balance the human stories with some analysis of the benefit of the service that you're providing. So to begin with, I often frame our program using national data to support the need, kind of the need statement. So I remind people that 95% of the people that we incarcerate in this country are coming back to our community, that the vast majority of these people were born and raised in our communities and are coming home. Over 600,000 men and women will be released from custody in 2016 alone. Here in Oregon, approximately 50% of them are released homeless without any identified housing upon release. And it's nice to illustrate the cost. Each recidivist in Oregon costs over $100,000 to reincarcerate. Reducing recidivism by just 1 percentage point equates to over $4 million in annual savings here in Oregon. Finally, the cost of services at programs like sponsors pale compared to the duration and cost of locking someone up in a county jail or state prison where they go for years. So that's my last slide. I think I've talked enough for one stretch, but before I close, I'd like to mention one thing. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if I can be of assistance in your efforts to build, grow, or sustain your programs. The sad reality is far too many people released from prison without the benefit of decent reentry supports. Fortunately, it's people like us who are shifting the landscape nationally, making reentry a priority in our community, wherein I would be honored to assist you in your efforts if I am able. With that, it's time to kick it back over to our moderators, and thank you for listening to me today.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Erik, both for taking the time to do this presentation today. I think it was some really great information, and I hope that everyone on the line saw kind of the connection between some of those overarching broad strategies all the way to the specific strategies that Paul and the team at Sponsors have been doing to sustain their programming. So as Paul mentioned, you can reach out to him and as well as Erik and myself. All of our contact information is posted on the slide that you should be able to see right now. And we're going to go ahead and have some time for questions. So some questions have been coming in throughout the presentation, but please, as we are addressing those questions, I'll read them off and direct them to Paul or Erik, but please continue to submit your questions as we go. All right. So just to get things started, we had a question from someone who works on a coalition that isn't quite a nonprofit yet. They have a fiscal agent who works for the coalition, but they're working on fundraising as a coalition, and and until they can become a nonprofit agency. So let's start with Paul, and then Erik, if you have advice as well, chime in after. What is some advice or some tips for a coalition that's trying to raise money? I'll go ahead and start with Paul.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess one of the questions that I would ask, are any of the coalition members nonprofits? Because it really is helpful when you're raising money to have one body that can act as kind of the conduit for donations. People are much more likely to give to a 501c3 nonprofit, particularly if you're seeking foundation grants or government contracts. Having said that, they may be able to get corporate sponsorships or individual donations without having a 501c3 set up yet. But if there is someone within the coalition that has a nonprofit, that's probably where I would start in trying to solicit contributions.
Yeah, that's similar to my experience as well, because we do work with a number of fatherhood coalitions and collaboratives around the country. And I'm in, actually my home office is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and there is a Pittsburgh Fatherhood Collaborative that we've been involved with over the years as well. And they've done something very similar. It's usually, there's a group called the Allegheny Intermediate Unit that is typically the lead fiduciary for the collaborative work. And oftentimes they will, you know, they will be the ones that submit the proposal, and if funded, they kind of administer the funds, but the partners within the coalition are formally built into the proposals, you know, when they're sent. So they know, and it also gets buy-in from the other collaborative members as well. But sometimes things come up where one of the other collaborative members may actually be in a better position to go after funds than the lead fiduciary, and that's kind of one of the advantages of having a coalition or a collaborative is that you do have multiple kind of entry points for potential funds and different ways of accessing those funds. Now, we also work with at a county level, we use our community mobilization approach, which is a three-phase process that the counties, sometimes at a city level, but usually at a county level, will go through. They will initially, phase one is they'll do a needs and assets assessment, which will culminate in a report. Phase two is when they'll do a leadership summit on fatherhood, where they bring in community leaders representing all sectors of the community. They do a facilitated discussion and so forth. That becomes part of phase three, which is where they develop a county or a citywide action plan to promote responsible fatherhood. And those are all some form of a collaborative or coalition. And again, some of them start out with a lead fiduciary, either in some cases it's been a mayor's office or a city county office. Sometimes it has been a nonprofit. But then as they move into doing and establishing their own 501c3 for that city or county initiative to become its own entity, that's where they will typically do a transition. And oftentimes that's when they get a larger sum. I know some at the county level have received some, larger, million or multi-million dollar grants, and at that point they're able to really establish their initiative as its own thing.
Great, thank you both for that. So I just want to make a quick note. We've gotten a few questions just about whether the slides will be available, and just want to remind everybody that the recording of this webinar as well as a PDF of the PowerPoint will be posted on our website in the next few days. So just be on the lookout at csgjusticecenter.org for when that's posted. So the next question that we had was, how do you address a situation where different funders might have conflicting interests? I guess that could be, maybe you have a federal grant that's more restrictive, you have private donations or a private funder that wants you to go one way, but the federal grant has a different mission. It may not necessarily, it could be two different private sources. But in your experience, how have you addressed those types of conflicts? We'll start with Erik and then go to Paul this time.
Yeah, we've had some of that, within our organization, but we also, again, we work with a lot of agencies across the country that we've kind of helped them navigate those things, especially when there were some larger federal grants we were managing, like the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse, where we provided the technical assistance for all the fatherhood grantees, and also the capacity building initiative that we did, which was also funded out of HHS. And in those situations, we've really, tried to help them to compartmentalize certain aspects of their delivery of their services and programs, so that there were clear boundaries around certain activities. And a great example of this is that there were a lot of faith-based organizations that have received federal dollars to do fatherhood work or healthy marriage group work or some reentry work as well. And we had to work with them just to make sure that that they had protocol in place and that they had very clear boundaries around where they delivered certain services, that the people who were delivering or facilitating those particular aspects of their services or programs were also trained and brought up to speed on, what was within compliance of one project versus another. And oftentimes then when they were able to articulate those kind of things, having that protocol in place to both, funding sources that may have had an issue with it, that tended to, relieve some of the concerns that those funders had and allow them to kind of continue moving on. But they also had to have very clear, reporting processes in and a clear line of where the budget aligned with the actions and activities of the organization.
This is Paul. So from my perspective, I think where we have run into these type of challenges has been a couple different situations. One was in a situation where a federal or state funder limits the use of funding that is important for us to achieve the goals in the grant or initiative that we're trying to do. And I touched on that, like with our mentoring grant. The feds a few years ago said that we couldn't use Second Chance Act funding for food or incentives. And so one of the things that we've begun to do when we start writing grants is really not looking at just the parameters of the budget that we're submitting, but really building out the budget for the whole program and figuring out if this funding source is unable to cover all of our needs, where are we going to go to get the additional funding? And usually you're not talking about a lot of money if you're just augmenting services for a large federal grant, but it is important that you have those things in place. The other area where we've run into contradictory instructions or restrictions has to do with kind of the clientele that we're able to serve. So sometimes there are requirements that we not serve sex offenders. And for us, that's an important population. Here in Oregon, they represent about 30% of the state prison population and roughly equal number of people that are releasing. So we've tried to find other types of funding sources to make sure that we're not leaving a target population behind in a service that is critical. So those are kind of the two examples off the top of my head that I can think of where we've been able to come up with workarounds.
Great, thank you. We have a question about just where should people go to find funding opportunities, specifically some of the federal opportunities that were discussed on this webinar, if there are any listservs that people should consider signing up for. I'll make a shameless plug for our own newsletter. The National Reentry Resource Center does send a newsletter out monthly where we do post funding opportunities that the government makes available as long as they pertain to reentry, reentry and behavioral health, reentry and mentoring, any of those intersections. So that's one place you can go. Another one is the Office of Justice Programs funding website. It's ojp.gov/funding. That's where you can find current funding opportunities that are available throughout any of the offices under OJP, which is part of the Department of Justice. So that includes the Second Chance Act grants, as well as other programs. So those are two that we, obviously our own website and OJP's website, we use a lot here at the Justice Center. But just really quick, Paul, any suggestions on listservs or newsletters or websites that people should check out for funding opportunities?
You know, those are two of my favorite. In addition, I mean, I think it's important to really get an understanding of the foundation landscape in your state. And usually, I mean, there are different places you can go. You can go online and look up 990s to see how people are giving, but you can also get on listservs for some of the bigger foundations in the state that send out their RFPs when they announce them. And usually there are books, too, that you can buy that are like foundation guidebooks that have been really great resources for identifying foundations either nationally or within a region.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you, Eric. Did you have any?
Yeah, I know many of you certainly have a, a strong overlap with fathers, whether it's related to mentoring, reentry, or, incarceration programs. And so if you are already signed up for our blog, which is you can find at fatherhood.org, and you just sign up for that. When we do come across any, funding opportunities that kind of cross over into, fatherhood or father and family enrichment, we do let people know, make them aware of that. And then also, Ronin, we do have a funding web page, and I can send you that link if you'd like to. I don't know if that's something you might want to send out, or if anybody is interested in that, you can email me directly, and I'll be more than happy to send you the link to that web page. But it's a kind of a collection or compendium of some strategies on funding, but then at the bottom of the page there's a list of some sites and funding sources that we've come across that have been helpful for us and for our partners, and I'd be more than happy to make that available to anybody.
Great, thank you, Eric. One thing that we can do, I'll mention this here, and we'll see if we're able to do it. I can grab some links from Paul and Eric and add those to the PowerPoint slides. So when those are posted on our website, you'll be able to you'll have those available to you on the PowerPoint slides. The next question was actually from a for-profit agency. While the majority of the conversation today has focused on nonprofits, we'll put this question out there, Eric and Paul, and see if you have any insight. They were asking, how can we pursue support funding, such as for clothing or extra bedding space, if you're a for-profit agency? And this agency, the agency asking the question, runs a residential reentry program. So again, that's asking how can we pursue support funding for things like clothing and extra bedding space, being a for-profit agency. And we'll start with Paul. Sorry about that.
Okay. That's a really good question. I'm not sure that I have any great ideas off the top of my head aside from soliciting contributions from possibly corporate sponsors or individual donors who are less concerned with a person's nonprofit status. I do know that we have worked cooperatively with some of our partners in the community that are other nonprofits. St. Vincent de Paul is one that does a lot of remanufacturing of beds, and we're able to get stuff at steep discounts. So, there may be opportunities to reach out to other partners in the community that are doing that type of work and to be able to purchase stuff at a discounted rate. But in terms of finding financial support, I think it's a little bit challenging without a nonprofit status outside of maybe the individual donor community and corporate sponsorships. And I'm curious what Erik may have to say about this.
Go ahead.
No, I'm done.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just going to actually spin off of what you were saying there in that, I would recommend also to, certainly position it, whoever you might be speaking with in, seeking those kind of donations or funding, of course, is very similar to what you would do from a nonprofit perspective, and that is to, position, your presentation from the perspective of the impact that you're having and how you are enriching the families that you're serving and the community, And also would draw you back to maybe some kind of a strategy like I put out at the beginning, where you have some kind of a focus group or some kind of a survey that you can have people go through, either by conference call, by phone, or in person, that will open up other kinds of resources or unlock keys, to help unlock areas that maybe you haven't thought of, that could, help you get to, your end result as well, what you're looking to do. And again, I just recommend everybody take a look at that and, modify something, to work for your setting and for your particular approach, because we know that working within the, from a for-profit versus a nonprofit, ultimately it does come down to, how we are able to communicate in a way that they can connect with and it makes sense to them coming from their lens, from their sector, and try to, bring it to life, from that perspective. So that's just an approach that I would say is, focus in on those couple of things and see if there's maybe some undiscovered or uncharted opportunities for, for somebody to help fill the gaps that you have, and maybe in return you might be able to, assist them in other areas.
Great, thank you. We had a question from someone who said that their executive director doesn't want to use public funding because the requirements could cause them to change their service model. This is an organization that provides housing, care, and support for men paroling from life sentences. So, and they were just asking about suggestions for sustaining without federal funds. I do want to say just right off the bat, I believe the question came in before Paul's section, so you probably saw that Sponsors is an organization that does a lot of housing services and focuses on housing services. So I would definitely encourage you to reach out to Paul for more information on their work. But I will say this is a common issue, especially for smaller nonprofit agencies, that whether it would change their service model or they just simply don't have the capacity to meet those requirements. So one thing I think that Paul mentioned that was really helpful was, looking into the other sources. Maybe federal funding would be too restrictive, but there might be some local, county, or state funds that might be a little bit easier to manage. And definitely the foundation support and the private donations that were explored earlier in the presentation. I also wanted to, or the next question that came up was, I think a good one, but not necessarily an easy one to answer. It was asked, where do you find good grant writers? So I know both of your organizations have had to write plenty of grants before, so we'll start with Erik. We've only got a few minutes left, but we'll quickly answer this one. Erik, what has your experience been in trying to find grant writers who can kind of get the message across and help get some funding?
Yeah, it is. That's especially challenging, and especially when you're going after some of the larger, federal or state proposals that are out there. And we had for a while, when we were receiving a lot of public funds, we did bring on a couple of specific grant writers who had that expertise. And even, with that, it was very challenging because it's very time consuming, as many of you know, and you're putting a lot of eggs in your basket and investing a lot up front for what may or may not come to fruition. And if it doesn't, you've invested a lot of time and energy and dollars into that. So finding that balance. But what we eventually did was we started working with some like consulting firms or specialists who that's what they do. And some are set up on where they get a percentage if it's funded, but they do some stuff, pro bono up front, so you have to look into that. And others, you still have to invest in on some level with them, and it's just kind of a risk that you take, and if you don't get it, you lose whatever. But I do suggest, looking into that. And then we also, had some staff that took advantage of different kinds of proposal writing courses and things that we were able to come across, just by talking to other people. And sometimes, again, you can also partner with other agencies who have maybe a more fully developed development staff. And particularly if it's something you might be able to do a joint proposal on, or somebody might be able to be a primary fiduciary, and maybe you're coming on as maybe you don't have the staff to do, but you might partner with another larger agency who have a development staff and say, if you guys take the brunt of putting this together, we can provide you with this particular component of the project, which would be, hopefully your sweet spot. And so, you can do a joint proposal with somebody and, kind of leverage some of the resources that they may have as well. We've done that on some situations, and it's worked out very well.
This is Paul. I would add a couple of things. One is, as Erik mentioned, just hiring people to write grants can be a mixed bag. It can be an investment with mixed returns. And a lot of times, grants require not necessarily an expert grant writer, but somebody who can write well, answer questions, and understands the mission of the agency. Because really you're trying to put together a compelling narrative that weaves in all of the questions that they want answered. So most of our foundation grants we do internally. The bigger grants, as Erik mentioned, some of the more complicated, like low-income housing tax credit grants or these pay-for-success grants that are really complicated, it may make sense to look for an intermediary that can assist. Or one of the things that we've done also with some of our federal Second Chance Act grants, since most of them are targeted at local government, is partnered with our local government friends, either in Health and Human Services or the Sheriff's Office, where they have grant writers and work as a team to put together a proposal. So those are all different ways that we've been able to kind of go after grant funding.
Great, thank you. So we're just about at the end. There were a few more questions that we won't have time to get to, but I did want to mention there were a few questions specifically for you, Paul, less about sustainability itself, but around your programming, in particular how you address the need to get, how you work with mentors to work with a population who has been incarcerated, and how mentors are, if mentors are community trained and based. So I just want to put out there, while not directly related to sustainability, there's definitely a connection there in that, how you set up the programs will set them up for success or not. And I think sponsors have done a very good job of that. So I encourage you to follow up with Paul to get some more information about how their mentoring program works. So like I said, unfortunately, we are out of time. I do want to send another big thank you out to Erik Vecere and Paul Solomon for taking the time to share their experiences and their knowledge with us today. I think it was a very helpful and very informative webinar. If you do have additional questions, all of our contact information is posted on the slide right now, so please jot that down. We're also going to be posting a PDF of the slides and a recording of the webinar on our website, which you can get to at csgjusticecenter.org. One note, I do want everyone to notice that in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, in your chat box and in your Q&A box, there has been a link to a survey. We encourage you to fill out that survey. It'll help us improve our resources that we're providing to you and come up with new topics that might address some challenges that you're facing that we haven't had a chance to lead webinars on or provide resources for yet. With that, this concludes the webinar for today. Thank you again to Erik and Paul, and thank you for everyone who joined us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Erik. Thanks, Ronin.
Thank you.
Yep.